This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 6 of Season 2 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, February 6th, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford 114 years ago as we read. The first section in February 6, 1909 is the Westford Center section. Reverend and Mrs. Charles P. Marshall and little daughter Marion have been spending a few days this week in Boston, Mr. Marshall attending the Chapman revival meetings. Mrs. Marshall enjoyed a good concert at Jordan Hall with Professor Gabrilowitz as pianists as the special attraction. They were also guests at Mr. Marshall's brother's home in South Weymouth. H.G. Osgood also attended the Chapman meetings with Mr. Marshall. I should mention that they're referring to John Wilbur Chapman, who was born in 1859 and died in 1988. He was a Presbyterian evangelist in the late 19th and early 20th centuries who began preaching in 1893 with Dwight L. Moody. Billy Sunday was one of his disciples. In March to November 1909, that is shortly after this date, they had a worldwide campaign that took them to Australia and the Far East. Postmaster Wright has received from the Postmaster General an amendment to postal laws and regulations in regard to the mailing of postcards as follows. Cards bearing particles of glass, metal, mica, tinsel, or other similar substances are unmailable, except when enclosed in envelopes tightly sealed to prevent the escape of such particles, or when treated in such a manner as will prevent the objectionable substances from being rubbed off or injuring persons handling the mails. Under this order, persons mailing these cards must put a 2-cent stamp on the envelope, whether there is writing on the card or not, and tightly seal the envelope. The Edward M. Abbott Hose Company held its regular monthly meeting Monday evening at its comfortable quarter on the Boston Road. A fine supper in charge of John Feeney Sr., John Feeney Jr., and Alistair McDougall was served. Miss Alice C. Abbott entertained a group of Lowell friends at Bridge Whist last week Thursday at her home on Main Street. Mrs. Mary E. Fletcher is making preparations to move from the house that has been her home for 38 years, that was the house at 62 Main Street, into the house owned by Oscar R. Spaulding, recently vacated by Mrs. Isles and Miss Moran. The purchaser of the Fletcher farm, Walter J. Merritt, plans to make quite extensive repairs and renovations on the place. The last entertainment in the Grange course, which takes place Thursday evening, February 11th, will be a stereopticon lecture on, quote, Alaska of today, end quote, with 150 colored slides giving many aspects of life in this new country, its industries, people, and its great natural beauties. A well-attended meeting of the WCTU, that's the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was held at the pleasant home of Mrs. Emery Whitney on Wednesday afternoon. Arrangements were completed for a food sale to be held at Mrs. Whitney's home on Tuesday afternoon, February 9th. The sale will commence at the noon hour as a convenience for the students at the academy and continue later for the convenience of other patrons. The next section is called Concert. A large and appreciative audience gathered at the town hall last week, Thursday evening, for the next to the last entertainment in the Grange course. It was a concert of unusual merit, such as lovers of good music do not often enjoy without going to the city. It was arranged under the capable supervision of Albert E. Prescott, the well-known musician of Boston, and Westford people feel very grateful to him for securing such particularly good talent for his hometown. Those who sustained the fine program From the best composers were Mrs. Addie R. Koval, mezzo-soprano, Miss Mary Ellis, violinist, Miss Beatrice Holbrook, pianist, and A.E. Prescott, bass. The next section is entitled Death. Word was received Sunday of the death of Frank A. Shaw at the home of his aunt, Mrs. Annie L. Coolidge, Stephen Street, Lowell. Miss Coolidge discovered that her nephew was dead Sunday morning. He had been subject to epileptic seizures, and Dr. J.V. Miggs, medical examiner, pronounced death due to suffocation. The deceased man's mother was Clara Coolidge, daughter of Orrin Coolidge of Westford, and the family homestead, which was located at what is now 17 Forge Village Road, and I think that the original Coolidge buildings are still there, was where Ralph Bridgeford now lives. Much sympathy is felt for Miss Coolidge, who was left by this death the sole survivor of her family circle. The next section is called Congregational. Reverend Paul G. Favor of Littleton occupied the pulpit at the Congregational Church last Sunday morning in exchange with Mr. Marshall. Mr. Favor preached an inspiring sermon that held the closest attention of his hearers. The theme of his discourse was, quote, "A closer harmony with the infinite," end quote, and was clearly elucidated with many excellent illustrations. He further assisted in the service with his fine tenor voice. The Christian Endeavor service in the evening was conducted by Miss Sarah W. Loker, with India as the subject. Papers and talks were given on special phases of the missionary problems and on phases of present-day problems of life in the newly awakened East by Miss Loker, Mr. and Mrs. Leonard W. Wheeler, and Mrs. Lillian Lumbert. The next section is called Club. Tuesday afternoon, a large number of members and guests of the Tadmuck Club gathered in the vestry of the Congregational Church for what proved one of many enjoyable and profitable afternoons. Miss Emma E. Tenney of Littleton was the speaker of the afternoon and gave the story of Mendelssohn's life and compositions, with selections assisted by Mrs. Ada L. Weber, soloist, also of Littleton. This current year, which is the 100th anniversary of the birth of a number of famous people in the realm of music, is the centennial year of the gifted composer Felix Mendelssohn. This German-born pianist and conductor lived from 1809 to 1847. The next section is Graniteville. The members of A.R. Schote Hose Company held their regular monthly meeting in Healy's Hall Monday night. As last week Friday was visiting day for the teachers, there were no sessions in the sergeant school here. The next section is called Death. Mrs. Melvina Hall, an old and highly respected resident of this village, died suddenly at her home in West Graniteville early Monday night, aged 72 years. Mrs. Hall attended to her usual household duties during the day and prepared the supper. While partaking of the evening meal, she was suddenly taken with a violent fit of coughing that brought on a hemorrhage, and she died in a few minutes. She leaves a husband, John Hall, as well as many friends in this village to mourn her loss. The members of St. Catherine's Temperance Society held a very enjoyable box party and social dance in Healy's Hall on Friday evening, January 29th, that was a great social and financial success. This box party was something in the way of an experiment, and some of the wise ones predicted its failure. Nevertheless, the committee in charge stuck faithfully to its task, and being aided by the hearty cooperation of the other members of the society, the result was entirely satisfactory to all parties concerned. Dancing was commenced promptly at 8 o'clock and until 10 o'clock, when an intermission was declared, during which R.J. Heeman, as auctioneer, disposed of the numerous boxes. All found ready purchasers, and much merriment was derived as the oddly associated couples wended their way to supper. After refreshments had been served, dancing was resumed and kept up until 12 o'clock. The Westford Grange Orchestra furnished excellent dance music. The affair was largely attended, and many being present from out of town. The next section is the Forge Village section. The pupils of Cameron School will observe Lincoln's birthday with exercises fitting for the occasion. Samuel Blodgett, who was operated on for appendicitis last week, is reported to be gaining but very slowly. It is rumored that the harvesting of the ice on Forge Pond will be completed this week. The ice is of excellent quality, and the weather has been all that could be desired. A number of our village people who are interested in music attended the concert given by the Choral Society of Lowell last Sunday, going by way of the electrics. That is the electric trolleys, of course. The next section is the About Town section. George Spaulding bought 2 cows of Alec Fisher last Saturday and attempted to drive them to his farm on Francis Hill in Chelmsford. Like Alec Fisher lived at what once was called the Running Fox Farm, right at the corner of Main Street and Depot Street in Westford Center. So it's a bit of a drive out Main Street to Francis Hill. Like some folks all the time and all folks some of the time, the cows immediately developed a stubborn opposition promenade against being driven. They took to the fields regardless of ownership, boundary lines, or fences. Neither a coax nor a threat had any effect to persuade them to line toward home. They took to the woods and remained all night, and the midwinter chill cured them of their fright. Sunday, they gladly observed as a day of rest and followed the narrow way home at their owner's request. The snowstorm of last week, for a small one, displayed the tactics of blockade that belonged to a more formidable affair and attempted to dispute the right-of-way of the electrics from Brookside to Westford. On Saturday, 1 car was knocked out in the first round and was obliged to put back into port at Brookside. Thence on for a time schedule, time was snowed under with the track, and go as you please reigned with the snow. Somewhere toward the midnight hour, the snowplow did the first plowing of the season, and Sunday morning the blockade was declared off, and the cars ran on rails and time until toward the noon hour, when the wind and snow formed a merger and drifted the tracks, and then came a setback. Traveling for the next 24 hours was mostly go as you please. Our old-timer townsman, nimble of step and rugged of health, Theodore H Hamlet, has been obliged to call out the reserve forces of a temperate life to help control the stubborn resistance of a bad cold. The reserve forces won without any run. He is now out on the street, a 90-year-old example of how to live to keep on your feet. It is reported on good authority that George W. Kenrick, Kenric, the superintendent of the J.F. Fletcher Cold Spring Farm, has resigned his position to take effect in early March, he having bought a farm. Everything about the farm and buildings is impressive of successful farming. It seems like a lot of the more wealthy farmers up in the Westford Center section hired full-time superintendents to actually run the farm. The high school and academy will give a dance in the town hall Friday evening, February 12th. The proceeds to go towards a new piano. The evening will be in charge of 2 of our well-known teachers, Mrs. Babbitt and Bartlett. The reference here to the, quote, the high school and academy, end quote, is unusual since they are really one and the same thing. Westford sent several sleigh loads of compliments to the annual dance at Littleton last week, Friday. On Wednesday, February 3rd, was the triple birthday of Mr. and Mrs. Francis W. Bannister and their eldest daughter, Frances. While this event comes around as often as the earth goes around the sun, yet very few are the families that this peculiar birthday merger ever gets around to. That is 3 members in the same family sharing the same birth date. Leonard W. Wheeler, with his unequaled aptitude for collecting the assessed resources of the town, he was the local tax collector, is lining up the delinquent taxpayers with a sort of final warning of the hurry up order. Better get onto the collector's bandwagon before he plays that final tune, the music of which will be written in the annual town report. Frank D. McGlinchey was seriously and possibly fatally injured Tuesday forenoon at the Herbert E. Fletcher Company's stone quarry, being struck on the head by some portion of the machinery connected with the derrick. He was removed to the Lowell Hospital, where he lies in an unconscious condition. The full details of the accident were not publicly known at time of writing. We will learn more about Mr. McGlinchey and his accident next week and the following week. John A. Taylor attended the annual meeting of the alumni of Amherst College at Boston Monday evening. About 450 were present. At a recent meeting of the class at the Emerson School of Oratory in Boston, John A. Taylor was chosen to deliver the class oration at the commencement exercises in May. So this John A. Taylor is Samuel Taylor's son, who graduated from Boston University and then the Emerson School, and ended up teaching in a college in North Dakota. Matthew Downs, the proprietor of the old famed Brick Tavern at what is now 266 Groton Road, met with an accident last week while returning from Lowell. In attempting to turn out of the car tracks, the sleigh caught in the rail. The horse, being 80 years younger than the driver, gave a sudden spring and threw Mr. Downs out. He was picked up and taken to the blacksmith shop of Warren Gould at Middlesex Village, it being proposed to take him to the Lowell Hospital. Mr. Downs, being a man of strong home attachments, at once came down heavily with a veto, and those in charge acquiesced in his home attachments, where he was removed, and Dr. Varney of North Chelmsford was called, who found a fracture of 3 ribs and a general assortment of bumps and bruises. There is good prospect of a resumption to normal conditions, even if 84 years have made the path back more difficult. That's the news in Westford for the week ending February 6, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Westford Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.